Hello and welcome to Short Story Scene. I'm your host, the storyteller, and here we have a tale called The Man and the Snake by Ambrose, Bierce. It is a verbatim report and a rest of so many that now the wise and learned, now the gay say, it is ye serpent, his eye hath the magic property that who's fallen into the vision is drawn forward in despite of his will, and perish miserably by ye creature his bite. Stretched at the ease upon the sofa, in a gown and slippers, Hark Brayton smiled as he read the foregoing sentence of old Molster's Marvels of Science. The old marvel in the matter, he said to himself, is that the wise have learned in Molster's day should have believed such nonsense as to reject by most even the ignorance in ours. A train of reflections followed, for Brighton was a man of thought, and he unconsciously lowered his book without altering the direction of his eyes. As soon as the volume had gone below the light of sight, something in the obscure corner of the room recalled his attention to his surroundings. What he saw in the shadow under his bed were two small points of light, apparently about an inch apart, that might have been reflections of gas jet above him and the metal nail heads. He gave them all a little thought and resumed his reading. A moment later, some impulse which did not occur to him to analyze, impelled him to lower the book again and seek for what he saw before. The points of light were still there. They seemed to have become brighter than before, shining with the greenish luster which he had not at first observed. He thought, too, that he might have moved a trifle, were somewhat nearer. There was still too much in the shadow, however, to reveal their nature and the origin of indolent attention. He resumed his reading. Suddenly something in the text suggested a thought which made him start and drop the book for the third time in the side of the sofa. Once escaping from his hand, it fell sprawling to the floor. Back upon the Brighton, half risen, was staring intently into the obscurity beneath the bed, where the points of light shone with. It seemed to him an added fire. His attention was now fully aroused, his gaze eagerly and imperative. It disclosed almost directly beneath the footrail of the bed and the coils of the large serpent. The points of light were its eyes. Its horrible head thrust flatly forth from the innermost coil and resting upon the outermost was directed straight toward him, and the definition of the wide and brutal jaw, the idiot-like forehead serving to show the direction of his malevolent gaze. The eyes were now longer, merely luminescent points. They pointed onto its own with a meaning of malign significance. A snake in a bedroom of a modern city dwelling of the better sort is, happily, not so that the common phenomenon is to make explanation altogether needless. Harker Brayton, a bachelor of 35, a scholar, idler, and something of an athlete, rich, popular, and of sound health, had returned to San Francisco from all manner of remote to unfamiliar countries. His taste, always a trifle luxurious, and taken on an added exuberance from long privation, and the resources of even the Castle Hotel being inadequate for their perfect gratification, he has gladly accepted the hospitality of his friend, Dr. During, the distinguished scientist. Dr. During's house, a large old-fashioned one, in what was now an obscure quarter of the city, had an outer and visible aspect of reserve. It plainly would not associate with the contagious elements of the altered environment, and appeared to have developed some of the eccentricities which come of isolation. One of these was the wing, conspicuous, irrelevant in a point of architecture, and no less rebellious in the matter of purpose, for it was a combination of laboratory, menagerie, and museum. It was here that the doctor indulged in the scientific side of his nature in the study of such forms of animal life as endangered his interest and comforted his taste, which, it must be confessed, ran rather to the lower forms. For one of the higher types nimbly and swiftly to recommend itself unto his gentle senses, it had the least to retain certain rudimentary characteristics, ailing it to such dragons of the prime as toads and snakes. His scientific sympathies were distinctly reptilian. He loved the nature's vulgarians and described himself as Zola of zoology, his wife and daughters not having the advantage to share his enlightened curiosities regarding the works and ways of our ill-starred fellow creatures were, with needless ostracity, and excluded from what he called the snakery, and doomed the companionship with their own kind, though to soften the rigors of their lot, he had permitted them, out of his great wealth, to outdo the reptiles in gorgeousness of their surroundings and shine with a superior splendor. Architecturally and in the point of furnishing, the snakery had the severe simplicity befitting the humble circumstances of its occupants, many whom, indeed, could not safely have been entrusted with the liberty which is necessary of the full enjoyment of luxury, for they had troublesome particularly of the being alive. In their own apartments, however, they were under a little personal restraint, as was compatible with their protection from the baneful habitat of swallowing one another, and, as Brayton had thoughtfully been apprised, it was more than tradition that some of them had the drivers times been found in parts of the premises where it would have embarrassed them to explain their presence. Despite the snakery, it is uncanny association, to which, indeed, he gave little attention. Brayton found life at the During mansion very much to his mind. Beyond a smart shock of surprise and shudder of mere loathing, Mr. Brayton was now greatly affected. His first thought was to ring the call bell and bring a servant, but although the bell cord dangled within easy reach, he made no movement towards it. It had occurred to his mind that an act might subject him to the suspicion of fear, which he certainly did not feel. He was more keenly conscious of the incourteous nature of the situation than affected by its perils. It was revolting but absurd. The reptile was of a species with which Brayton was unfamiliar. Its length he could only conjecture. The body at the largest visible part seemed about as thick as his forearm. In what way was dangerous, if in any way? Was it venomous? Was it a constrictor? His knowledge of nature's danger signals did not enable him to say. He had never deciphered the code. It was not dangerous. The creature was at least offensive. It was de trop matter out of place, an impertinence. The gem was unworthy of setting. Even the barbarous tastes of our time and country, which had loaded the walls of the room with pictures and the floor of furniture and the furniture with bric-a-brac, had not quite fitted the place of its bits of savage life of the jungle. Besides insupportable thought, the exhalations of his breath mingled with the atmosphere which he himself was breathing. These thoughts shaped themselves from greater or less definition of Brayton's mind, and begot action. The process is what I'll call consideration and decision. It is thus that we are wise and unwise. It is thus that the withered leaf in the autumn breeze shows greater or less intelligence than its fellows. Falling upon the land or upon the lake, the secret of human action is an eye one. Something contracts our muscles. Does it matter if we give the predatory molecular changes the name of will? Brayton rose to his feet and prepared to back softly away from the snake, without disturbing it, if possible, and through the door people retire so from the presence of the great. For the greatness of power, and the power is a menace. He knew that he could walk backward without obstruction and find the door without error, should the monster follow. The taste which had plastered the walls with paintings had consistently supplied a rack of murderous oriental weapons from which he could snatch one and suit the occasion. In the meantime, the snake's eyes burned with more pitiless malevolence than ever. Brain lifted his right foot free from the floor and stepped backward. At that moment he felt a strong aversion to doing so. I am accounted brave, he muttered. Is bravery then no more than pride? Because there is none to witness the shame, shall I retreat? He was steadily himself with his right hand upon the back of the chair, his foot suspended. Nonsense, he said aloud. I am not a great coward as the fear it seems to myself afraid. He lifted the foot a little higher by slightly bending the knee, and thrust it sharply to the floor, an inch in front of the other. It could not think how it occurred. The trial with the left foot had the same result. It was again in advance of the right. The hand upon the chair, back was to gripping it, and the arm was straight. Reaching somewhat backward, one might have seen that he was reluctant to lose his hold. The snake's malignant head was still thrust forth from the inner coil as before, the neck level. It had not moved, but its eyes were now electric sparks radiant from the infinity of luminous needles. The man had an ashy pallor. Again he took the step forward and another, partly dragging the chair, which were finally released, fell upon the floor with a crash. The man groaned, and the snake made neither sound nor motion, but its eyes were two dazzling suns. The reptile itself was wholly concealed by them, and gave off enlarging rings of rich and vivid colors, which were the greatest expansion successfully vanished like soap bubbles. They seemed to approach his face, and anon were the immeasurable distance away. He heard somewhere the continual throb of a great drum, with desultory burst of far music, inconceivably sweet, like the tones of the Ionian harp, and knew it was the sunrise melody of the Memnon statue, and the thought of he stood in the Nile's side reeds, hearing with the exalted sense and the immortal anthem through the silence of the centuries. The music ceased, rather it became by insensible degrees of distant roll of retreating thunderstorm. A landscape glittered with the sun and rain stretched before him and arched with a vivid rainbow, framing it in a giant curve in the hundreds of visible cities. In the middle of the distant vast serpent wearing a crown, rearing its head out of the voluminous convulsions, and looked at him with its dead mother's eyes. Suddenly the enchanting landscape seemed to rise swiftly upward like a drop seen at a theater, and vanished in the banks. Something struck him hard below upon the face and breast. He had fallen to the floor, and blood ran down from his broken nose and his bruised lips. For a moment he was dazed and stunned, and lay with closed eyes, his face against the door. In the few moments he had recovered, and then he realized that his fall, with the withdrawing his eyes, had broken the spell which had held him. He felt that now, and he kept his gaze averted, and he would be able to retreat. But the thought of the serpent within a few feet of his head, yet unseen perhaps, in the very act of springing upon him and throwing its coils around his throat, was too horrible. He lifted his head, staring again at those baleful eyes, and was again in bondage. The snake had not moved, and appeared somewhat to have lost its power upon the imagination. The gorgeous illusions of the few moments before were not repeated. Beneath the flat of the brainless brow, its black, beady eyes simply glittered at first, with an expression unspeakably malignant, and was as if the creature, knowing its triumph assured, had determined to practice no more alluring wiles. Now ensued a fearful scene. The man, prone upon the floor within a yard of his enemy, raised the upper part of his body upon his elbows, his head thrown back and his legs extended to the full length. His face was white between its gouts of blood, and his eyes were stained upon the outermost expansion. There was froth upon his lips. It dropped off in flakes. Strong convulsions ran through his body, making almost serpentine undulations. He bent himself at the waist, shifting his legs from side to side, and every movement left him a little nearer to the snake. He thrust his hands forward to brace himself back, it constantly advancing upon his elbows. Dr. During and his wife sat in the library. The scientist was in a rare good humor. "I have just obtained, and by exchange with another collector," he said, "a splendid specimen of Orpheophagus." "And what may that be?" the lady inquired with somewhat languid interest. "Why, bless my soul, what profound ignorance, my dear. I am a man of as certainty as after marriage that my wife does not know Greek is entitled to a divorce. The Ophagus is a snake which eats other snakes." "I hope it will eat all yours," she said, absently shifting the lamp. "But how does it get the other snakes? By charming them, I suppose?" "That is just like you, dear," said the doctor with an affection of petulance. "You know how irritating to me the illusion is that the vulgar suspicion about snakes' power of fascination." The conversation was interrupted by a mighty cry which rang throughout the silent house like the voice of a demon shouting in a tomb. Again and yet again it sounded with a terrible distinctness. They sprang to their feet, and the man confused, and the lady pale and speechless with fright. Almost before the echoes of the last cry that died away, the doctor was out of the room, springing up the staircase 2 steps at a time. In the corridor in front of Brayton's chamber, he met some servants who had come from the upper floor. Together they rushed at the door without knocking. It was unfastened and gave way. Brayton lay upon his stomach on the floor, dead. His head and arms were partly concealed under the footrail of the bed. They pulled the body away, turning it upon the back, and the face was dabbed with blood and froth. The eyes were wide open, staring at a dreadful sight. "Died in a fit," said the scientist, bending his knees and placing his hand upon the heart. While in the position, he happened to glance underneath the bed. "Good God," he added, "how did this thing get in here?" He reached under the bed, pulling out the snake, and flung it, still coiled, to the center of the room, whence, with a harsh, shuffling sound, it slid across the polished floor to stooped by the wall, where it lay without motion. It was a stuffed snake. Its eyes were 2 shoe buttons. And that concludes the story of The Man and the Snake by Ambrose Bierce. If you like this content and like to support it, please head to Patreon. That is www.patreon.com/shortstoryscene. And thank you to my Patreon Drac for all your support. And thank you all for listening. And see you next episode. Bye.